I had barely survived my third miscarriage when my mother-in-law walked into my hospital room carrying divorce papers instead of flowers. She placed the folder on my bed without looking at the blood-stained blanket beneath it. "I've already had the lawyers prepare everything," Diane said calmly. "Sign now, and you'll leave with enough money to start over." My husband didn't argue. He didn't even look at me. He stood by the hospital window while his mother gave him 30 days to choose between me and the family fortune. "Divorce her," she said, "or you'll inherit nothing." I watched the man I'd loved for 7 years lower his head and ask for time to think. That was the moment I realized I had already lost my marriage. What none of us knew was that I hadn't lost 3 babies by chance. Someone had been making sure I never carried a child to term. The frightening part, it wasn't because they hated me. It was because they were terrified of who my baby would become. Daniel used to leave notes in my coat pockets. Small, stupid, wonderful things. Bought the good coffee. Don't let me forget to grind it. Tucked in where my fingers would find them on cold mornings. I still have 4 of them, folded into quarters, in a shoebox I haven't opened since the separation. That's the version of him I tried to remember first, before I let myself remember the rest. We married 8 years ago in a garden his mother chose, at a venue his mother chose, in a dress his mother had opinions about. I told myself that was just what it looked like to marry into a family with a 100-year-old name attached to a company. I told myself Diane's coldness was just formality, not forecast. The first miscarriage came at 11 weeks. Daniel cried harder than I did. I remember being almost grateful for that, like his grief could stand in for mine while mine was still too raw to name. Diane sent a card, not flowers. A card with a line about trying again soon that I read 4 times trying to find warmth in it and never did. The second was, at 9 weeks. Diane started scheduling wellness check-ins, a nutritionist, an acupuncturist, a specialist she'd flown in from Geneva without asking me. I told myself it was concern. I was already lying to myself by then. I just hadn't noticed the shape of the lie yet. It was around the second loss that Vivian started appearing at family dinners. Diane introduced her as practically family, the daughter of an old business partner, recently back from London, unfailingly warm to me in a way that never quite reached her eyes. She brought me a set of prenatal vitamins once imported, so much better absorbed, she said, pressing the bottle into my hands like a gift she'd thought about for weeks. I took them every morning for 4 months. The third pregnancy ended at 13 weeks, the furthest we'd gotten, which somehow made it worse, like grief had learned to be crueler with practice. I remember the doctor's face more clearly than I remember my own thoughts that day. Careful. Rehearsed. The face doctors wear when they suspect something they can't yet prove. "Your blood work shows some irregularities," she said. "I'd like to run a few more tests if you're willing once you're ready." I wasn't ready. I said maybe later. I didn't know later would almost be too late. That night, Diane came to the hospital with a folder instead of flowers, and Daniel stood at the window with his back to me, and I understood, before either of them said it outright, exactly what was coming. Diane's ultimatum wasn't cruelty for its own sake. That was the thing I couldn't explain to people afterward, the thing that made it so much harder to hate her cleanly. She believed, with the total conviction of a woman who had spent 40 years protecting a legacy, that she was doing the responsible thing. Her husband had built Halston Textiles from a single mill into a company with his name stitched into 3 continents. She had buried him believing her only remaining job was to make sure it didn't die with her. "I'm not asking you to stop loving her," she told Daniel, in a conversation I wasn't meant to hear but did, standing in the hallway outside his study with my hand flat against the wall like it could hold me up. "I'm asking you to be honest about what love can and can't fix. Grace cannot give this family what it needs." "That isn't cruelty, Daniel. That's arithmetic." Daniel didn't answer for 11 seconds. I counted them without meaning to. "I need time," he finally said. "You have 30 days. I went home that night and didn't tell him I'd heard any of it. I wanted to see, without an audience, what he'd choose, what he thought no one was watching him choose it. What he chose was distance. Small at first, working later, sleeping in the guest room so you can rest. A gentleness that felt less like care and more like a man rehearsing an apology he hadn't given yet. He stopped leaving notes in my coat pockets. I noticed before I let myself admit I'd noticed. Vivian came by twice that month, ostensibly to check on me. Both times she brought a fresh bottle of the vitamins unprompted, refilling the old one before I'd even finished it. "You need to stay strong," she said, "for whenever you're ready to try again." I thanked her. I had no reason then to hear anything underneath the kindness. On day 26, I found the second folder. A draft, this one, with Daniel's handwriting in the margins where he'd been negotiating terms with himself. Alimony structured one way, then crossed out and restructured another. A man trying to be decent about an indecent thing. I didn't confront him with it. I wanted him to bring it to me himself. I think some small, stubborn part of me still believed he would tear it up instead. On day 30, he sat across from me at our kitchen table, the one we'd bought together in our first apartment, scarred with a decade of takeout containers and homework and one memorable red wine ring neither of us had ever managed to sand out, and he told me he thought we should separate. Not divorce. Separate. As if the smaller word would cost him less. "Just until things settle," he said. "I'm not giving up on us." "You're giving up on me," I told him. "There's a difference and you know it, or you wouldn't be so careful with the word." He didn't argue. That was somehow worse than if he had. I moved out on a Tuesday, which felt like an insult in itself. Grief deserves a more dramatic day of the week. I packed 13 boxes. Daniel carried 4 of them to the car and apologized for not carrying more, and I remember thinking that was the whole marriage in miniature. Enough effort to feel present, never quite enough to matter. Diane didn't come to help me pack. She sent a check instead, folded into an envelope with my name spelled correctly, and nothing else. No note, no cruelty even, just the particular coldness of someone who considers a transaction closed. I rented a small apartment above a bakery that started its ovens at 4 in the morning. For the first 2 weeks, the smell of bread woke me before my own grief did, which felt, in a strange way, like mercy. Something in the world still rising while I couldn't. I stopped eating properly. I stopped returning calls from the handful of Halston family friends who'd been my friends too, once, before the divide made itself clear to everyone but me. I kept, out of habit more than hope, the last unfinished bottle of prenatal vitamins Vivian had brought me. I don't know why I couldn't throw it away. Some part of me, I think, was still holding onto the last version of myself that had believed a future was coming. Daniel called 4 times in the first month. I answered once. "I still think about the notes," he said, out of nowhere, like the sentence had been sitting in his throat for weeks. "The ones I used to leave you." "I kept them," I told him. "I don't know why I'm telling you that." He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry, Grace. I don't know how to be the kind of son who disappoints his mother. I've never had to be." "You didn't disappoint her," I said. "You obeyed her. Those aren't the same thing, and I think you know that too." I hung up before he could answer. It was the last conversation we had for nearly a year. News came to me sideways, the way it does when you're no longer inside a family, but not quite outside it either. Vivian was seen more often at Halston events. Diane began introducing her at galas with a warmth she'd never once extended to me. By spring, there were whispers of an engagement, not yet official, but inevitable in the particular way these things become inevitable once a matriarch decides they will. I told myself it didn't matter. Most nights, I even believed it. Grief, I learned, doesn't leave. It just eventually stops being the only room in a house. I'd trained as a textile designer before I married into a textile family, a small irony I hadn't appreciated until it became the only thing standing between me and total collapse. I found a job at a small design studio 3 blocks from the bakery, run by a woman named Priya, who asked exactly one question in my interview that mattered. Can you still find beauty in something, even when you're not sure you deserve to look for it? I said I didn't know. She hired me anyway. The work was slow, physical, forgiving in a way people hadn't been. Thread doesn't ask you to perform recovery on a schedule. Fabric doesn't need you to be fine yet. That's where I met Julian. He came in on a Thursday, commissioning fabric for a restoration project, a converted mill building, ironically enough, though not one of Diane's. He was an architect, easy in his own skin in a way I'd forgotten men could be, and he asked about the pattern I was working on with genuine curiosity instead of the practiced interest I'd grown used to at Halston dinners. "What's it based on?" he asked, running a thumb near the edge without touching the actual fabric, a small courtesy I noticed and appreciated more than I expected to. "Water damage," I said. "There's a stain on my old hospital room ceiling I used to stare at." I turned it into a pattern instead of a memory. He didn't flinch, didn't perform sympathy, didn't ask the follow-up question everyone always asked. He just nodded, like that made perfect sense, like turning pain into something you could hang on a wall was simply what people did. "It's good work," he said. Not because it's sad. Because it's honest. I didn't fall for him that day. I want to be clear about that, because the truth of slow rebuilding is less romantic than the stories make it sound. I went home that night and cried, not because of him, but because someone had looked at my work without pity for the first time in over a year, and I'd forgotten how unfamiliar that would feel. He came back the following week. And the week after. Never pushing, never performing patience the way Daniel used to perform gentleness. Just present. Consistently, unremarkably present. In a way that took me months to trust wasn't a prelude to a withdrawal. Chapter 5. Two lives diverging. A year became 18 months. I made partner track at Priya's studio. Julian and I became something neither of us rushed to name, which was, I came to understand, its own kind of gift, a relationship with no folder waiting at the end of it. Meanwhile, from a distance I'd stopped trying to close, Daniel's life kept moving in the direction his mother had drawn for him. The engagement to Vivian was announced that spring, in the kind of society column I used to appear in myself. Diane was quoted calling it a new chapter for the family, and I read the words with less pain than I expected, a small, quiet proof that I really was healing, not just performing it. What I didn't expect was the phone call in early autumn, from a number I didn't recognize. "Grace? This is Dr. Anwar. I treated you after your third loss. I know it's been a long time." A pause. "I've been going through some old case files during a lab audit, and something's been sitting wrong with me. I'd like your permission to run a retrospective test, if you're open to it, on some records we kept, and something you may still have." I thought immediately, unreasonably, of the unopened vitamin bottle still sitting in the back of my bathroom cabinet, an artifact I'd never had the will to throw away. "I think I might still have something," I told her. "Give me a day." That night, Julian sat with me at my kitchen table while I turned the bottle over in my hands, reading the imported label I'd never once questioned. "You don't have to do anything with this tonight," he said. "But whatever it turns out to be, I'm not going anywhere while you find out." It was the first time in over a year that someone's steadiness didn't feel conditional on the answer. The results came back 9 days later. The vitamins weren't vitamins, not entirely. Dr. Anwar was careful with her words on the phone, clinical in the way doctors are trained to be when delivering something that isn't quite an accusation yet. A compound had been introduced into the supplement, she explained, one linked in rare cases to early pregnancy loss when taken consistently over months. Not something that would show up in a routine panel. Not something anyone would think to test for unless they already suspected the loss wasn't natural. "I can't tell you who did this," she said. "I can only tell you what was in the bottle and that it wasn't an accident. The dosing was too consistent for that." I didn't need her to tell me who. I already knew. The way you know a splinter is still in your hand before you find it, a low, persistent wrongness I'd been carrying since the day Vivian first pressed that bottle into my palm with a smile that never reached her eyes. I called Julian before I called anyone else. He didn't tell me to be calm or to be careful or any of the things people say when they're managing your reaction instead of sharing it. He just said, "What do you need me to help you do?" What I needed was proof strong enough that Diane couldn't explain it away as coincidence, because I understood, with sudden clarity, exactly what Vivian's endgame had been. She hadn't just wanted Daniel. She'd wanted the version of Daniel that came with an empty nursery and a mother-in-law already primed to blame me for it. Every miscarriage had bought her patience. Every ultimatum had bought her proximity. She hadn't waited for Diane to force a choice. She'd engineered the conditions that made the choice inevitable. It took another 6 weeks to build something undeniable. Dr. Anwar's lab report, a former Halston housekeeper willing to confirm she'd seen Vivian restocking the bottle herself rather than sending it through the household staff, and the piece that finally closed the case, a receipt from a specialty compounding pharmacy in Vivian's own name, dated the week before she'd first brought me that gift. I sat with all of it spread across my kitchen table, Julian across from me, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not yet. Just a terrible, clarifying grief for the version of myself who'd taken those pills every morning, grateful for the kindness, never once suspecting the hand that offered it. I didn't go to Diane first. I went to Daniel. We met at a cafe neither of us had chosen for sentimental reasons, Neutral ground, his suggestion, which told me he suspected this wasn't a reconciliation before I said a word. I slid the folder across the table. It felt, I noted with some private, exhausted irony, exactly like the one his mother had once handed me in a hospital room. He read in silence. I watched 4 years of certainty drain slowly out of his face, replaced by something rawer than I expected. Not disbelief, but the specific horror of a man realizing he'd chosen the story that was easiest to live with over the one that was true. She knew, he said quietly, meaning Vivian, though for a moment I couldn't tell if he meant his mother too. She let me believe it was just bad luck. Genetics. She let my mother believe it was you. She didn't let anyone believe anything, I said. She built it, brick by brick, bottle by bottle, for 2 years, while you were busy deciding I wasn't worth fighting your mother for. He didn't defend himself. That, at least, had changed. Diane's reaction, when Daniel brought her the same folder 3 days later, was not the reaction I'd have predicted a year earlier. There was no performance of grief, no dramatic collapse. Just a long silence, and then a single question, asked so quietly Daniel told me later he almost didn't hear it. How long? Since before the first loss, he said. Diane called off the engagement herself. Within the hour, in front of the same board members who'd once watched her hand me a separation folder, without a flicker of hesitation. Vivian's calls to the family went unanswered. The compounding pharmacy receipt made its way, eventually, into a police report, quietly, without the spectacle the story might have had elsewhere, because Diane, whatever else she was, still understood that some fights were better won without an audience. Daniel came to see me one final time, at the studio, after everything had settled into its new and permanent shape. He didn't ask me to come back. I think some exhausted, honest part of him already knew what my answer would be. I keep thinking about the arithmetic my mother talked about, he said. What this family needed. I never once did the arithmetic on what I needed. I just let her hand me the equation. I hope you learn to do your own math eventually, I told him. I mean that kindly. I just don't need to be in the room when you finally do it. I married Julian 11 months later, in a small garden neither of our mothers had picked out, in a dress I chose entirely because I liked how the fabric moved. Diane sent a gift, not a folder, this time, but a length of vintage silk from the original Halston mill, with a note that read only, I was wrong about what this family needed. I hope you'll forgive me for taking so long to understand what it actually cost. I don't know if I've fully forgiven her. I know I no longer need to, for either of our sakes. Daniel wasn't at the wedding. He sent a card instead, a strange, quiet symmetry to how this all began, in a hospital room, with a card that never quite reached warmth. This one did, at least. I hope he leaves notes in your pockets too, it said. You deserved that from the start. He wasn't wrong. He just understood it 4 years too late. I got pregnant 8 months after the wedding, naturally, easily, under a doctor's careful watch that had nothing to do with suspicion this time, only ordinary, hopeful caution. Julian cried when we heard the heartbeat, unguarded in a way Daniel had only ever managed once, and I let myself feel, for the first time in years, that the future wasn't something being decided for me in a room I wasn't allowed into. Sometimes I think about that hospital ceiling, the water stain shaped like a comma, and how I turned it into a pattern instead of a wound. I think about the folder Diane set on my tray table like a verdict. I think about how certain she was that arithmetic could measure a person's worth. She was right about one thing in the end. It just wasn't the equation she thought she was solving. If you were Grace, would you have forgiven Diane? Or was Daniel's 4 years too late reckoning the only ending he deserved? Tell me below. If this one hit you somewhere real, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.